So we have Bill Bonstra from his firm in Washington, D.C. We have Cecily back from yesterday, which is Design Collective, of course, and Antonio Bello, who apparently these guys graduated at the same time, more or less, within a year of each other. And he's the head designer over at Remy Parker. We're going to be joined by Ralph Cunningham and Chris McCabe, who will be coming shortly, hopefully. We're going to be going, spending our time in Washington and Baltimore area today. So we're kind of, yesterday we were all over the globe, which was kind of fun. But today we're staying mostly in Washington and Silver Spring and Baltimore. And
Well, pick the right day.
well, there was a little bit of madness to this plan, of the assignments, let's say. So Joanna's going to take us to an area in Washington, D.C. that most of you know. And she's going to be doing her project about St. Anne's Unity House.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. My name is Joanna Hess, and this is St. Anne's Unity House, Architecture as a Means of Supporting Family Structure. I just want to take a minute and thank my thesis chair, Professor Dan Curry, and thesis coordinator, Professor Carl Dupuy, for all of their support this semester and valuable knowledge throughout this whole process, and really pushing me to get to this point. I also want to thank my classmates for all their support over the past few years and for inspiring me every day, so thank you. So St. Anne's Unity House, is a transitional housing program for single mothers. It's a safe place for them to go to when they find themselves in dangerous or unhealthy situations for them and their child. It's an extension of an already existing Catholic charity called St. Anne's Center. So Unity House acts as a bridge between St. Anne's Center and society. It's the next step for them to really gain more self-sufficiency and independence before going out into the real world. So this thesis helps people like Nairobi and her daughter who were able to call St. Anne's home last Christmas, as well as these two children who are playing at the daycare center at St. Anne's. This topic is important and necessary for multiple reasons. One being that when it comes to homeless families, which means a single parent and a child, it's 98.3% of the time the mother and child as opposed to the father and child. Some of the things that contribute to this woman's situation is either physical or mental health issues, being in physical danger in their home, or not having enough income to support their child. And this last point is one of the main causes of this. So especially in DC, which was ranked as having the highest child care prices in the US this past year, on average it's $2,000 a month for an infant child care and $1,500 a month for a toddler child care. This comes out to 28% of the median income in Washington, D.C., which means that many times a parent has to stay home. And if you're a single parent, you're left with even fewer options. And all of these women at St. Anne's, they are single parents and are well below the median income. So that's the background. The agenda for today is to give you a little information on St. Anne's Center and how the idea for this thesis came about. Then we're going to talk about the inspiration and the precedents that contributed to it. Then continuing on to the program and how the program influenced the site selection and design concepts. And then lastly, we'll talk about how all these items contributed to the building form. So beginning with St. Anne's Center for Children, Youth, and Families, this is where really the idea for this thesis came from. As I said before, it's a Catholic charity that focuses on helping single mothers and children. They really, when a mother and child arrive at St. Anne's, they're given a place to stay where they can gain strength. And St. Anne's really strives on providing them the skills necessary to have a successful future. So some of these programs include life skills, parenting classes, career counseling, and ways for these women to finish their high school education. Historically, St. Anne's has always helped mothers and children. It was founded by the Daughters of Charity in 1860, and this group of nuns still runs St. Anne's today. It was DC's first orphanage called St. Anne's Infant Asylum, And it really gained its importance when Abraham Lincoln signed it into an act of Congress in 1863. So throughout history, the missions have adapted as society's needs have changed. When it first opened, it brought in abandoned children and widowed mothers that were affected by the Civil War. In the mid-1960s, it focused on pregnant teenagers whose families would send them off to St. Anne's to kind of hide them from society. And then now they focus on really keeping the mother and child together and providing the woman these life skills in order to be a successful mother and woman. This is an image of Sister Mary. She's the CEO of St. Anne's, and she's been very influential in keeping St. Anne's missions current to women's needs. She's also been my main point of contact for this thesis. So throughout its existence, it's moved around to different locations in DC. It started in Foggy Bottom off of K Street. Then it moved to a building in Colorama off of California and Connecticut Avenue. In the 1960s, it moved to Hyattsville, right outside of DC, in a neighborhood called Avondale, and that's where it resides today. And Noma is the location of this thesis site. This is St. Anne's current location and building in Hyattsville. It was built for them in the 1960s by the Archdiocese of Washington. It's very large, and a lot of it is used for the Archdiocese storage. As you can see, it's in a more secluded and private area. It's not in an urban setting. This seclusion can be helpful for women who are just arriving at St. Anne's and are just beginning to heal, but once these women want to become more independent and self-sufficient, it becomes difficult since there's a lack of opportunity and easy access to transportation in this location. So St. Anne's currently has a couple programs for these mothers. They have the Teen Mothers and Young Mothers program. So they have Grace House, Faith House, and Hope House. The Teen Mother program has stricter rules and curfews, and the Young Mothers is a little bit more independent. So this is where the idea for Unity House came from. It really acts as the next step for these women. Once they feel like they can live on their own and get more self-sufficient and independent, they can move to Unity House. It acts as the bridge, like I said, between St. Anne's Center and society. And they will be paying rent and grocery shopping and doing laundry, etc., but they'll be surrounded by women with their similar life experiences. So some of the goals for this thesis and some very important elements that should be in the environment of Unity House is promoting self-sufficiency, fostering growth and health, and providing a supportive community. This is a quote from one of the St. Anne's residents, and she explains how these women really rely on each other and they help each other gain strength with their relationships that they have. So that's why creating a community, that's why creating a community for these women is so important. Some architectural models for community that I looked at was La Tourette and Big Yard. Being that St. Anne's is run by nuns, it was interesting to look at La Tourette as it's a monastery. I looked at how both of these buildings were connected to nature, their courtyard, unit layouts, common spaces, and materiality. Thinking about the program elements of this thesis, three main program elements are the living quarters, common spaces, and the daycare, and it felt necessary to have all of these overlap with the outdoor space and the green space. This is dividing up the program spaces and giving them square footages to make sure that I have to decide how much space Unity House actually needs. So with this program analysis, it helped decide a site, which is in DC. We're going to zoom into this location here in Noma. Noma recently, in the past few years, has been developing a lot of residential and commercial buildings, and there's a lot of opportunities in this area. Some of the neighborhoods surrounding this site, so it's in Nova, but it's right near Union Market and Gallaudet as well. It's actually in the neighborhood Eckington, which is in Noma. Some of the areas of interest that are nearby is there's a school, which has elementary, middle, and high school. So that's important for if one of these women has a child that is old enough to be in the public school system, they can walk to school. There's retail right across the street, as well as grocery store, walking distance to 2 metro stops on the Red Line and Union Market, of course. The transportation is very easily accessible for this site. There's a bus line right at the northwest corner, and it's also about a 5-minute walk to the Noma Gaida metro station. There's also the Metropolitan Branch Trail, the walking and bike path that runs right along the site. Some land uses near the site is single-family and multifamily residential, some commercial buildings, a school, and some government buildings. There is a lot of more warehouse storage facilities in this area still, so it's a combination of residential and industrial. These next few diagrams are kind of the initial observations of the site and helped form where the building would be placed. So we have the surrounding building edges, the access and views to the site, the pedestrian intersections, possible circulation of the site. And then this is just documenting kind of things to remember. So the building that's across the street right here is currently being built, and they're going to have a pedestrian walkway. So thinking about how that would continue into this site, the Thesis site. Also thinking about how the southern portion right now is designated as Nova Green Space, and also the relationship to the sun. So with all of these diagrams, the building is placed at the northern part of the site. It helps hold the street edges and also has the most amount of daylight. The surrounding context, the building to the north is a government library storage. It has a mural of Abraham Lincoln on the back, which has been a theme. There's also the Metropolitan Branch Trail, which is this picture down here, and these murals are redone by local artists every year. The buildings on this corner are new residential buildings that are there. This picture is a picture of what the site currently looks like, and then the top picture is what's coming right across the street with the pedestrian walkway. Sorry. Okay. So moving into the building massing, the first move was creating a courtyard. This calls upon the precedents that I looked at, as well as the first initiation of daylight and community aspect. The second move was to push down the southern portion of the building to allow more sunlight into the courtyard. The northern bar created some step backs for balconies. This step was adding the chapel into the courtyard, as well as cranking the southern bar at 10 degrees to allow more space for the chapel and more sunlight into the courtyard. And this final step was creating undulations on the facade. This is the turnout of what it looks like. And this diagram shows all of the indoor common spaces. Common spaces are important in order to develop the supportive community for these women. This is the outdoor common space, which is the courtyard. And then this is the indoor-outdoor spaces that are either not conditioned, or if it's a nice day, you can open up and it continues out to the courtyard. This is all of them together. So since building a supportive community is important, there needed to be a lot of areas where these women's time would overlap so they could build these relationships. Another design concept that was important to this thesis was sunlight. Sunlight has a lot of positive effects on your mental and physical health. It gives you a sense of calmness and satisfaction. It also helps with your immune system and metabolism and sleep habits. So from this sun diagram, you can see that at every day of the year, sunlight enters the courtyard and hits the northern units. Some other design concepts, I focus on the individual areas. So a theme running through all of them is making them minimal, clean, safe, comfortable, and a connection to the outdoors. So we have units, courtyard, therapy rooms, common rooms, chapel, and a park. This slide shows the materials and how they're applied to the building. Since St. Anne's has a deep history in DC, and it is an institution, concrete seems like it would show its substantial and permanence. So the use of concrete panels is very prevalent on this project. It's also going to be white concrete, which is reminiscent of the monastic architecture. Their walls were all whitewashed to to present purity. This is going to represent new beginnings and fresh start. The wood cladding on the exterior helps soften the concrete panels to make it not as, to kind of help balance the institutional feel. And then getting into the plans. So this is the ground floor, and some of the main areas on this floor is the daycare and the lobby. So this is a view of the daycare. And the daycare is very important since, as I mentioned, there is a lack of affordable daycare in DC. So this is for the residents, but it's also for the neighborhood. So people in the neighborhood can afford to send their child to this daycare. This is the lobby view, and it's where everyone checks in. It's the main access to the street. It's also where all the security happens, so you don't have unwanted guests coming up to the other levels. The mezzanine level has the loft of the daycare, which you can see in this section. So the area, the perspective before showed the double height space, and here you can see how there's rooms back in the other spaces. This is the second floor, which is kind of the main level. It's the courtyard level. The courtyard is divided into 3 areas. The most western area is the more active side, where everyone's coming and going. Visitors might come to that area. The middle section is for more playing and hanging out, and it's a continuation of the great room. And then the eastern side is the more quiet and calm side and reflective side. It has the chapel, and it's right outside of the therapy and counseling rooms. Some important areas for this floor is the library and great room. It's also where the units of the south building start, which are 2-story units. This is a library view looking out through the great room to the courtyard, and you can see the 3rd floor unit entryways up above. This is the first floor plan of these units on the southern bar, the kitchen and living room. The 3rd floor is where all the units begin, so it has the 2nd level of the units on the southern bar, and then the main, and then the units on the 3rd floor. So this is the 2nd level unit plan with 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and this is the main unit type on the 3rd floor on the north bar, which is a studio. The 4th floor, the main unit type, is a 1-bedroom, and they have a common room and shared laundry. And then the 5th floor, which is the final floor, has the main unit type is 2 bedrooms, and they share a miniature courtyard with the unit next to them. And they also have shared laundry and a common room. This building on the site plan was formed from the site diagrams, and something that was important was to have the pedestrian walkway of the building across the street terminated by a plaza, and then it continues to the Metropolitan Branch Trail over here. There's also a pathway that goes from the main corridor in the building all the way down to the second entrance to the park. These main pathways are lined by cherry blossom trees, which obviously has a big presence in DC, but it's also the theme of St. Anne's main charity event called Hope Blossoms. The street trees are oak trees, which are already there, and then the trail trees are linden trees. The portion of the site that's right around the building is natural play area for the daycare. And this was important because natural play is hard to find in the city, and it's something that's really good for child development. It helps their imagination and creativity. The middle section is a recreational area, and the southern section is a sculpture garden, which kind of reflects the murals along the Metropolitan Branch Trail. This is the final image. So in conclusion, this thesis creates a healthy and supportive community for these women, where they can help continue to prepare themselves for the real world and for a successful future for them and their child. So thank you.
Joined by Ralph Cunningham from Cunningham Quill, and we're going to be joined later by another colleague of ours, graduate and a member of Cunningham Quill's firm, etc. Let me go over that. I just wanted to receive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Can you walk us through how you get from the lobby up to the courtyard?
Sure. So the lobby is over here, and this grand hallway here is kind of the main corridor in the building and separates the public and the private areas. And so you come in the lobby, this is the elevator, which would take you up to the second mezzanine and the second floor. And when you walk out, you directly see the courtyard when you come out.
Okay, so that, the space that's over the lobby, what is that, a conference room or?
This,
Yeah.
yes, this is like, it's actually a dining room. It's for the residents. There's a kitchen attached here that kind of leads out. It's kind of a glass pavilion that can open up in the courtyard. But in the mezzanine, there is a meeting area for like board members over here.
Okay, thank you.
And just following up on that, the space directly across, what is the condition of that? So if you walk out of the lobby, would you be looking at the reading units, or would you be looking at what's a street? So what is that condition across?
Oh, it's behind it's behind townhouses.
I think I would have thought a little bit about how that, you thought a lot about pedestrian views on the adjacent development and how that leads to, I imagine those are park buildings near the railroad, or the two buildings?
These?
Yes.
Those are, yeah, they're like on the railroad. They're like one-story little sheds.
Okay. So, hopefully those have a civic presence and you've created a nice connection to the trail through that. I think I would have thought about your building entrance, even though it is residential, what it faces across the street. Put a lot of time into that sequence up to the courtyard and thinking through that. Having, perhaps this might have been a corner entry building or something. If you think through, why was it chosen to have that central spine as opposed to a corner condition or some other entry off of Main Street?
The central spine kind of came about since there are two bars of the building, and kind of only being able to come up on one side proved to be a little difficult. So coming in and being able to go out either way, I guess was one of the reasons, but that is a good point.
Well, I'm really happy to see the sections that you created, and helps me understand how the building works. And I think with Ralph's question, we were probably on the same track in that you sort of closed off that visibility. You do start kind of in the middle there, which makes some sense, but you don't appear to have any view of the courtyard even up through the building. Is that right?
I'm sorry. Do you
In
mean
that section above the daycare lofts and everything, it's fairly closed. You move to the north and you go steps through the meeting area and up, right?
Yes.
So there's a section over, the next one over is the section through the lobby, which proves your point.
Which you still don't have a visual connection.
Right.
Yeah.
Here,
Right.
right there.
Which I think.
Oh, so from the lobby to the courtyard. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and
Yes.
I think, if you follow feng shui, they would tell you not to have glass opposite your entry for monetary reasons, because they say, well, your money goes out the window, right? But we don't adhere to that concept typically. So you do have an opportunity there. I think your diagram, how you put a single-loaded building, from what I can see, against the north street, right? And everything's facing south, so you have an attitude about sunlight and about orienting that way, which I think was very nice in the diagram of the building. I think that connection may have helped to at least understand where you're going, especially when you put the chapel. Ralph has a nice building with the chapel. And that's a special piece that you probably want to remember spirituality, right? When you're coming here and you'll maybe see towards the sky and see the chapel, so
Right.
that kind of thing. But, you know, I like how you put that in the courtyard where you have a lot of elbow room, so to speak. So,
But it's the chapel of the trains, right?
Is the what? Oh, staring at the trains.
Chapel of the trains, which I actually think is kind of cool. I mean,
Our
if
Lady of the Highways.
Yeah, exactly, Our Lady of the Highways. I mean, if you think about that chapel, you're up, so you would be looking at the moving trains, and I think that's fine. I think that's actually kind of cool.
Okay.
I would say a couple of things. One, which I agree with my friend Mr. Bonestra, but a few things. One is I think that the basic scheme is very good, very clear. I like generally the organization of the building, so we'll start with that. And I think you've done the units pretty thoughtfully. As Bill said, they did get good light. Where I think you run into some trouble is if you look at these sections and you see that the courtyard is absolutely flat. And I think that's where you're missing something. So what I think would have been better, according to me at least, would be if this courtyard came in and fell down. In other words, you came in here and you were sort of going off the park and then going up into the courtyard. Mm-hmm. And that was a whole sequence of landscape spaces. So this space that you have right here, I think might be better there. You know,
Okay.
the rest of your building I don't think would change very much.
Right.
But I think the point, which I hadn't noticed until you said it, about what your entrance is looking at is actually a very, very important one. So if you can imagine if you came in here instead, you know, yeah, you're
Right.
looking right down an alley, and in DC that's just not going to be pleasant. But I think this site is fantastic. We've looked at a bunch of buildings on here. The MBT is the bicycle superhighway of Washington, so it is really important. And so I think your basic partie is really, really good, but you're a little bit trapped in section because all of your sections are pretty flat. And I think that, that whole mezzanine level, I don't see much really in it. I just think that you could have thought a little bit more about what the courtyard sequence is like.
Thank you.
Well, just following up on that, I would say that I think you put a lot of thought into the sequence through, and I thought you were very successful in organizing the program. So there are more public spaces along the street perimeter, especially to the north, and then it gets quieter as you move to the east, and obviously with the relation to St. Anne's, I think that's appropriate to put the chapel on that side. I don't mind the trains either. I think that's fine. Yeah. So I think the orientation that you had to sunlight and your approach to that was very successful. And I think some more permeability, some more thought to where the building faces in that sequence. One question I did have is what is there, so this is, they've almost graduated, if you will, to Unity House. What's the relationship, the connection still to St. Anne's? How, are there any other of the nuns still on-site living here? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there is definitely, so St. Anne's has a lot of people that work for them, that do fundraisers and volunteer work and things like that. So I do have space for them on the first floor in offices. And then I do have a sister suite if they want to, if they don't have to live here, but because they all live in Hyattsville. But if they come and stay, they can stay here if they want to. There also is some of the same programs that St. Anne's has, like the therapy and counseling. They also have help with like their resumes and things like that. But it is trying to have them be more independent and leave the more structured programs in Hyattsville.
Could a member of the community come and participate in services at the chapel?
No.
Is that
Well-
how they do things?
You have, no, yeah, no.
So we have clarity. Good.
Well, you
Yes and no.
can invite a guest to come, but they have to go through the security process and make sure that, but a random community member can't come.
They're not services, is what.
Right, exactly.
But is that because of the nature of the activity that happens there, that the chapel remains a kind of private thing? And, you know, when you think about monastic complexes, right, the chapel and the church is the interface between the private side of the monastery and the public plaza, right? So people could they couldn't get any further than that into the monastery unless there's a very specific reason. And you've put that deep into the, I just want to know. I'm
Yeah.
not saying it's the right or wrong answer.
And that's a good point.
Thank you.
Ask about a couple of things.
But let her finish the answer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Let her answer
Follow
now.
up on
Fine, you get a chance. Hold on, let her answer.
One thing that I wanted to do with this chapel was St. Anne's it is a Catholic organization, but it helps people from all religions and all demographics. So I didn't want it to be a Catholic chapel. It's more just a spiritual space for these women to go to than a religious space, if that makes sense. But
That's a better, I mean, so your interpretation of it is different than what you would find in more traditional versions of this, where those specific interface between the private sides of the building and the public. So,
But there was an idea of putting it in the site or in the park as well. So
I guess the only other question I would have is the levels of privacy in the building, whether, and from a kind of basic, I'd love to be on the train riding by and looking at that courtyard. It'd be nice for me to be on the train to do that, you know? I just wonder if having that so open is that great for the community. And it's so exposed. It just strikes me that these sorts of things, they benefit from some levels of privacy where, you know, people who might not want the world to know that they're there and getting help and things like that, and they can have an outdoor space that they go to. That's sort of the chapel that sort of makes me think about that. They can have an outdoor space that they can go to that they know they can't be seen. Is that a consideration for the population here?
definitely, there definitely is trying to be a balance between privacy, but also you do want them to be more adapted to the world and society.
But it seems to me you've solved that somewhat with the big park and the playground. I mean, that's the sort of place where you go, you know, that's very public, right? It just makes me wonder whether opening the courtyard up is really, even so, the trains are up too. I mean, maybe so. Maybe that, is there a section that goes through the trains that shows where the train level is and so on? It may be solved in section, you're right, but it just, you know, it would be a consideration, I think. That level of privacy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Where are the
That
rules?
was one of the points that I wanted to ask about. You have created this very private world in the courtyard, except for the vision. It seems to me that it might be possible to organize your activities around that courtyard, somewhat more beneficially. Things like the cafe, for example. Is it public? Is it private? Is this a place where the community is going to mix in? Or if it's, strictly for the women and families, would it want to be on the courtyard? If that's a kind of private locus of social activities. The other thing that I was a little bit concerned about was the daycare, because that is a mixing point, yet it seems to be awfully open to the park, and I think that the children are a group that you really want to protect. I mean, if the women are concerned about abusive fathers, perhaps, you wouldn't want there to be the possibility of them lurking in the park. So it seemed to me that the public and private were delineated somehow starkly here, but that there might be a little bit more care or something about where the security really happens, and then if you're going to venture out, what's the kind of interface between the sheltered society and the larger community. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was just the chapel, because it's such a special place. It's the jewel in the setting here. And by the way, you've given so much thought to the landscape. I really appreciate that a lot. So the chapel, these are just a few kind of architectural comments. One is that it relates very strongly to to one geometry of the site, but it doesn't seem to acknowledge the other geometry. And as a jewel, I think it doesn't have to have the same kind of architectural character as the setting that you've so carefully made. I think that it could become, somewhat special. I mean, it's sacred, right? So you have the opportunity to contrast the sacred and the profane here. So that's one thought about it. And then the other thought is really terribly practical structure. How is this thing coming down to earth? And having that object presence, both kind of theoretically and just plain, physically. Right. How is the thing, bringing its weight down to the earth? So I think, had you had another year to work on thesis that...
Well, the reality of that is it would have to be a wood chapel, because if it's a concrete podium, you can set a wood chapel on a concrete podium and not necessarily have to put the structure down through it.
But do you want to?
No, I don't know. That's what you have to do with what she's designed.
Yeah.
You want to
To the structure,
and the stuff about
Doesn't sound like you want to.
I just like to take it in.
So,
Yes, that's a
thank
good
you.
point.
Yeah. Thank you for the observation.
Yes, thank you.
I think one of the challenges of a project like this is trying to find the balance between the institution and it being an institution and at the same time being a home for many people. And I imagine that's something that you struggle with. On one hand, wanting it to be big enough that it could support enough women and create this community, and knowing that it was an institution certainly, but then also thinking about how could this feel like home to people. And I would like to hear a little bit more of how that struggle played out. Would you agree, was that one of your challenges?
Yes.
So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. Because when I just say, when I look at the elevation of this building right now, it feels a bit foreboding. And I wonder if there might, I'm sure you did a lot of versions of this. And yet, and I see the effort when we look at the interior with the trees and the play area and the garden that you were trying to find this other kind of language. So could you talk about your choice of materials and and just the massing of it and how you thought about that problem?
Sure. So definitely the materials played a role. As I mentioned, concrete and wood cladding. I was trying to make those two materials kind of form that balance of not being too institutional, as well as this facade shows the two-story units, which it's kind of replication of the townhomes that are across the street. So I was trying to make that more homey.
What were you trying to accomplish? Let's just look at the ground level of that elevation. What were you trying to communicate with that architecture and for the people who
So the ground floor is really supposed to show like just the podium level, and that everything for the residents is above it. And the very ground level, this is all a loggia that kind of leads you to the daycare if it's people from the neighborhood, instead of having to go through the lobby. And this inset area is for like covered outdoor play for the daycare.
That's functional. That's expressing the function. But you have a kind of duality here, right? You want to integrate this into the community, but at the same time, I think you want to shelter the people inside. And I think that these two impulses may be fighting here. you know, things like the very transparent lobby, the transparency of the daycare, these are antithetical to the idea of providing a sheltered living experience for people who are trying to get away from the world. But at the same time, we're trying to create a kind of integration into the community, make it work like housing and so forth. This is very hard, and I do not have the answer. But I think the question really was not what is the program inside, but it's more about what is this building saying? Because in a sense, it's monastic. It's renouncing the world. It's creating an alternate world. But at the same time, you're trying to connect to the community. It's very, very hard. That's a key.
Question though is whether
Yes.
well, I just want to pick up on that for a second, whether you can take the privacy.
Chance also.
Whether the privacy, that's an interesting project, whether the privacy is handled in plan or in section. In other words, whether, you know, the monastic complex, it proceeds in plan. The public stuff is towards the piazza and the private stuff is behind that. You've chosen a sectional way to sort of deal with public and private, which seems reasonable. The other comment I would make is that, and then I'll be quiet, Carl. Maybe. But if a religious group owned this site, you know, what they would probably do, they'd have to do, is monetize it in a certain way. And you would probably have a fair amount of private development involved with this so that it could bankroll the institution, you know. So, and I'm just saying that it's not necessarily a critique, it's just the reality today. We have seen in DC many ministers become real estate developers, particularly in Southwest, because they're sitting on pieces of land that have high value and they want to monetize it. So you would probably also be looking at the rest of your site. Maybe you wouldn't have this larger park, and you'd have some way to monetize that as well, to just provide a cash flow for the institution. But I think the problem of the privacy versus the sectional thing, which is typically what happens in cities, the more public stuff goes on the ground floor and the more private stuff goes up. Whereas in a non-urban situation or rural monasteries, it tends to happen in plan, where the private stuff tends to be behind the entry in the chapel. And that's sort of the dilemma.
Okay.
All right, Carl.
I just wanted to say one last thing.
You do.
I just wanted to say that, number one, I commend your choice of thesis. I think it's a really complex problem and a real one. I think expressing that and trying to solve it with architecture has all the challenges that were pointed out, and also the opportunities that you also took. I think the party is very clear. I agree with some of the comments that were made regarding the courtyard. One thing that I'm wondering is you give, this building is really, it looks kind of austere from the outside as you look in. And then inside there's this oasis of this courtyard. And when I look at the plan in the session, from the lobby all the way up, I almost want to celebrate that a little bit more and arrive at that courtyard, or at least have a clue that actually it exists sooner than later. And another thing that I make a comment in general for everyone in this room that are going to be practicing architecture, I think we need to appreciate a little bit more people with disabilities and how we are just one tumble away from being disabled, and the experience that the person in a wheelchair or person with mobility has, that experience, in my view, ought to be almost the same as for those that are able. We see this problem more and more being more prevalent. And in this particular case, I can see that not only it's a well-being thing, encouraging people to go up a stair, to go up and going and experience this courtyard. So with that, I also think that the problem of transition from this facility to the real world, you designed a building that wants to answer and help prepare these mothers to go back to society and being productive members of society. I've worked in projects that are not that dissimilar, affordable housing, and one thing that I found, architecture is only a part of the puzzle, but it's interesting, I think Matt Bell was starting to allude to that. It's interesting how programs that are created for future ownership of units encourage people to actually succeed and grow. I am afraid that a lot of these moms, a lot of these mothers that when they quote unquote graduate from this program, they might be in a tough situation if there is not a process like that. And so in terms of architecture, when I look at this building, I was expecting to see a little bit more rooms that could encourage people to be trained in culinary arts. For example, the kitchen be actually on the first floor, adjacent to a classroom, and multi-purpose areas like that that would allow people to actually get skills, because that was one of the things you alluded to in the beginning. So, and one final comment. When I've worked in facilities that have a component that requires counseling and therapy and so forth, there needs to be a care where you actually place that in plan. Because most often people do not want to go through large spaces where they can be seen going into that area.
Okay.
I'm dropping everything. So when you have to go to a library or a great room and go into a therapy, and the waiting area is all the way at the end. I find that to be a little perverse maybe. I would have put that in a more secluded part of the plan where you don't have to kind of display that you're going to go to that process. Although it's part of the healing process, and I get that. So I could keep going with this.
Thank you.
Sorry, just one last thing. So I'm going to give you all a rule that I try to apply, which is always put the building on the worst part of the site and always put the landscape on the best part. So, to sort of synthesize some of these comments, I think you have three worst sides, which is the north, the south, and the north, the east, and the west, and the south side is great. So again, that's a reason to have some kind of transition from the park into the building, the courtyard facing south. I think you could have had a building on the east side instead of the chapel, or maybe the chapel is in there. Because I from the first comment we talked about what are you looking at from this courtyard. So from this courtyard, you're looking at the trains, you're looking at the alley. You're not really looking at the park. I know you have this big cutout, which I think is a great move, but just think about that.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe we're talking about the sort of ambiguity of the building, and it's a tough problem. You have this whole counseling aspect of it. It's an institutional thing. It's monastic. To me, maybe there's a transition, and maybe that would help. That would solve your problem. If I could move from these units to these units out, you talk about a transition, right? To me, this is like Paris. We all sit in a chair and we face out, right? We're all facing one way. We're not facing each other. So maybe that's okay if you say, here's this process, the help, the cleansing, the self-confidence, and then I have a step and I can go out, right, to that world, which could be interesting. And that would be just an easy thing to talk about with what you've done.
Okay.
So I'm going to maybe disagree with a couple of the comments. One, I know that there is sensitivity to getting therapy, but I do think we need to, and I think we need to be sensitive about people going through that process. But I also think it's kind of illustrative of our attitude to mental health, that we want to seclude it and see it as something undesirable. I almost would encourage, and I do agree, I mean, I think the waiting area should be moved forward just for functionality, but I think we need to, while still giving people privacy, not approach mental health any differently than we do typical physical health. I think they're woven together, and I think they should have equal standing and not have the stigmatism. So just to put that out there, because I think that's something that we all need to address as we're designing into the future. I do think that this isn't monastic architecture. This is about families, and certainly they're in transition, but they are moving towards full integration in the community. They've already moved through a program that's much more sequestered, so I don't think monastic is the correct. I mean, it does have a chapel, but as you explained, it's more for reflection. It's non-denominational. I do think, however, though, that one of the steps to integrating, and I think you've addressed it, I just don't think you responded to it. I see the kitchen area and the dining area that has the street frontage. How do people, when people are inviting their friends over, right? Not just friends that they've made within the program, but the outside world. This is a place where they are transitioning, where this should be welcome. So I think that room that you have that's a large dining could be that space where that they may not feel comfortable having people in their unit, but they can have that, or they have a larger group that can be fully housed within their unit for dinner. But I think that's well placed, and I would celebrate that. I think, responding to the questions about how people come in and where the public interface or that semi-public-private space happens, I think you have all the constructs for that within this building, and just maybe articulated. I do agree with the comment about accessibility, because you're going to have people not just staying in the units, but visiting. It could be mother or child who's disabled, so really thinking about the sequence and making it more universal. So the elevator and a grand stair coming up into that space can celebrate the sequence up to the courtyard or those semi-private public spaces, and also just for the daily living, it wouldn't separate people.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we have to bring this discussion to a close. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us in a very stimulating discussion on some very important and challenging topics. So I've had the honor of working with Joe over 3 semesters now, from large-scale kind of master planning down to individual units. Some of the themes that I've seen developing in her work are just the enhancing public realm, long-term investments in community, and making great places. And I think those are interests that will certainly serve you well in your profession. I also want to thank you for sharing your passion for this organization. I don't know that she mentioned that she spent a lot of time volunteering for this organization as well. And so I think for you all to join me in thanking her for her work on this subject and her work with this very important cause.